Hi, my name is Yin Gao and welcome to Dr. Gao's classroom. Today, I'm going to introduce my longtime collaborator, Dr. David Musgrave. All the poems I presented in my videos are results of our collaboration. I would like to thank David on behalf of all my subscribers and friends who watched my video. It is David who polished and stylizes all the translations and make them beautiful and elegant. He is a distinguished poet with several publications under his belt. His latest publication is this one, a collection of poems. Dr. Musgrave has been collaborating with me for the last few years, translating hundreds of classic Chinese poems, and I enjoyed our collaboration immensely. Today, I'm very happy to have David join us here to discuss one of the projects David and I completed this year, the translation of Bai Juyi's epic romantic poem, The Ballad of Eternal Regret, or 长恨歌. Before we dive into that, I would like to invite David to talk to you. So David, would you like to talk a little bit about yourself and your research into Chinese poetry to my audience?
Sure, thanks, Yin. I've been learning Chinese for about 9 years. Before that, I studied Japanese at university, so I know a lot of characters and I understand a lot about different poetic traditions. I've been writing poetry for 40 years now. So my interest in Chinese poetry came about as I started to learn more and more about the language, and I found that I could understand in a very literal sense some of the original poems, but then of course I discovered very quickly that a lot of the cultural reference eluded me, and so it's been very illuminating for me to learn more and more about the Han Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, Song Dynasty, mores, cultural traditions, and even down to the very complicated names for example, the brazier that is used to scent clothes.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Or moth eyebrows.
Yes. Yes. Now let's talk a bit about our translation of the Ballad of Eternal Regret. I think it is best to use a few examples to show my audience how do you put this string of characters together to make them into beautiful poetic lines. I'll just read the Chinese first. 云鬓花颜金步摇，芙蓉帐暖度春宵。春宵苦短日高起，从此君王不早朝。Can you read the English translation first and then explain some of the difficulty you might have translating it?
Sure, Ian. Her hair was like a cloud, her face flowers, and she wore a golden hairpin. The empress spent the spring nights with her in the warm embroidered curtains. The spring nights were bitterly short, and the sun rose high. From there on, the emperor stopped attending the early court sessions. So one of the difficulties people face when they initially start translating Chinese poetry is the impersonality.
Yes.
And so in English, impersonal poetry would, in most instances, seem a bit cold, perhaps, or a little bit odd. So you have to somehow implicitly understand who the people involved are, and then you also have to decide on a tense, whether you're going to go in the present tense or the past tense or some combination thereof. This poem, I remember when we were translating it, the difficulty I had was with the sun rising high. I couldn't see, as an English reader of poetry, I couldn't see the connection between the sun rising high and the spring night being bitter. But of course, what it was is that the nights were too short for the emperor and his love. And so when the sun rises high, of course, this is a terrible thing because he can't spend the night with her in bed.
Yes, exactly.
So I thought that just talking about the shortness being bitter, making it an adverb would sort of convey that. And of course, the next line makes it really clear that, the emperor's neglecting his duty to attend court in the early morning. So there's that sense there of abandon, hedonism, and so on.
Yes, it is. It is a custom that the important meeting should be held in the morning, and then after the morning session, all the ministers will go to their different department and start work.
Mm.
So if the emperor would not get up early in the morning, lots of things could not get done.
That's right. The other thing that was a challenge was just the notion of the bedchamber being referred to metonymically as just a curtain. One thing I've discovered with a lot of the Chinese poetry is obviously there's figures of speech like metaphor and simile, but there's also a high degree of metonymy where often a character or even a myth or a story is evoked by a single word. In this case, hibiscus curtain, you have to be able to picture that there's heavy curtains maybe surrounding a bedchamber or maybe leading into the room. I'm not quite sure which.
The bed is usually, if you recall the huge bed in the royal court in UK, the kings, where they basically, when you draw down all the curtain, it form a little room.
Yeah.
It's very like a seclusive and very sort of intimate, sort of small space.
Yeah.
When you're in a huge bedroom, because the Chinese believe when you have too big a bedroom, it is actually not very good for the people sleeping there. So you got to make a small, intimate space for the couple to sort of, get close together. Mm. And when you draw all those curtains, hibiscus was the embroidery on the curtain. And then,
That was easy to imagine that if you had sort of curtains in a sleeping chamber, that you would want them to be beautiful and decorative and so on. So it was fairly easy just to sort of just refer to the bed as the warm embroidered curtains. I think that worked.
Yeah.
The conventions of beauty often a bit problematic in English. There's the notion sometimes of a hairstyle like cicada wings, the notion of the temples being cloudy, like having clouds there.
Yes.
The cloud hair. I think I had to go with a literal translation there. I don't think there was really any kind of equivalence that I could think of. I mean, there's been various different hairstyles in history, like bun would be one, or long golden tresses or something like that.
Yes.
But I think in this case, the foreignness of the cloud hair was sort of sufficient to convey this impression of exotic beauty for an English reader.
Yes, I think the cloud was kind of a way referring the very thick sort of hair. So here's a picture of the town court lady, and you can see the hair was very huge. Lots of decorative hairpins, combs, and headdresses. So because the Chinese believe a thick hair is a symbol of fertility as well as health. Mm. So when you choose a wife, you want to choose someone with lots of hairs. I think it's probably shared in our culture too.
Probably is.
I'm sorry, I'm not even like your losing hair,
That's all right.
But it is, quite common in Chinese. Recently we've been reading Bai Ji's poem lamenting that how much hair he was losing.
That's right, yeah.
So here's another example. Sometimes it is impossible to find an English counterpart for the Chinese characters. So how do you render these words and incorporate various interpretations into your translation? Let me read this piece in Chinese first. 渔阳鼙鼓动地来，惊破霓裳羽衣曲。九重城阙烟尘生，千层万骑西南行。
An army from Yuyang arrived with an earth-shaking sound, startling them in the middle of the song Raiment of Rainbows and Feathers. Smoke and dust arose from the 9-layered watchtowers as 1,000 carriages and 10,000 riders left in a line for the southwest. So the problem here is actually one of historical reference. Yuyang is actually a place, I think it was in the Warring States Kingdom of Yang, which is around Beijing and Hebei. To a Western reader, Yuyang is, unless you're a Sinophile, doesn't mean much. One possibility here would have been an army from the northern frontier. You probably, if you weren't constrained by trying to make it read like a line of poetry, you might say an army of northern barbarians arrived with an earth-shaking sound. So that's one problem. The other problem is the Feather Raymond song. I mean, for a Chinese reader of poetry, it would probably be well understood what that means, and it's referred to very elegantly and succinctly. Whereas in English, raiment of rainbows and feathers is a little bit prosaic and a bit of a mouthful. But in this case, again, the literal solution is probably the most accurate, because if you search for raiment of rainbows and feathers, you'll probably find the original song.
Yeah.
The 9 laid watchtowers, again, was something that probably had to be literal. It probably means a 9-storied watchtower. So
yes and no. Yes, because it is a different kind of layers of gates. The Chinese way of defending a city is that you have different layers of walls, and then you have watchtowers on each of those walls. And the Jiu also have a very important significance, because they here it is used to refer to the capital, because only the capital would have, and also the Forbidden City would have the 9 layers of walls. You know, it's like a circles of different walls, so that between the outer sort of city wall to the inner chamber of the court, you would have 9 layers of walls, and on each wall you would have a watchtower. So this is referring to the capital, because that's when the Tang Xuanzong, the Tang Emperor, fled from the capital, and here was referring to that the rebellion army were already attacking the capital, which is very serious, because you already have many other layers of defense before they reach the capital. So here is a very serious situation, because the enemy already arrived at the capital.
Sometimes you really need to have footnotes.
Yes. Yes. So in the following couplets, there are a lot of things listed there. Not only there is no counterpart in English, but no counterpart in contemporary Chinese. Okay, let me read the Chinese first. 六郡不发无奈何，婉转蛾眉马前死。花钿委地无人收，翠翘金雀玉搔头。君王掩面救不得，回看血泪相和流。
The 6 branches of the imperial army refused to take off, and the emperor felt hopeless, leaving the sweet and elegant beauty to die in front of his horse. Her flowery hairpin fell on the ground with no one to collect it, along with her phoenix headdress and jade hairpin. The emperor covered his face and could not come to her rescue. Looking back, it seemed he was streaming tears of blood.
So how do you render those terms, since we do not even know what they would like? For example, how do you translate all the the hairpins and the headdresses?
Well, being a bloke, it's a bit foreign to me. It's difficult because in some ways, the more you translate Chinese poetry, the more you realise that there are sort of go-to conventions, almost like cliches, to refer to conventions of beauty. And sometimes it's just easier to translate it as beautiful woman or beautiful headdress, because the actual detail is untranslatable.
So there is quite a few of that flowery hairpin and the golden phoenix and all that.
I think naming them is sufficient in English, because it implies something fancy, and there's enough resonance in the idea of the phoenix for a reader to imagine it without actually knowing quite what it looks like. The difficult one, I think, for the English reader is the moth eyebrow.
Yes.
In the Tang Dynasty, the moth eyebrow actually refers to eyebrows rising up like little moth wings, quite thickly actually. some people, I've read elsewhere that some people refer to the moth eyebrow as being fine and delicate, like a moth's antennae, but here in the Tang Dynasty it's quite specific. And conventions of beauty obviously change a lot from time to time and place to place. And if we were to talk about eyebrows like two moth wings, most people would not think that this was an extraordinary beauty.
Yes.
So I think we had to go with the idea of beauty.
Yes, yes. I think that I read that the Tang woman, they would have to shave off the eyebrow completely, and then get this kind of stone that is sort of bluish green sort of color and rub them into their skin. It's going to be very hard. So women always would endure anything to look fashionable. Well, I wouldn't say beautiful, because in today's standard, this probably would look really weird.
It's like in Japanese culture where women would lacquer their teeth with black lacquer.
Exactly.
And we would not necessarily think that that was extraordinarily beautiful today either.
That's right. So this poem, as I would call it, is an epic of romance. Many of the scenes described in the poem is highly emotionally charged, as in the last three couplets we just read. What are the emotions that you sensed when reading and translating this poem? Do you find these emotions similar to poems from, say, English poetry? If there are similar emotions expressed in English poetry, is there any difference in the way these kind of emotions are expressed? Do you find it difficult when interpreting and translating emotions from Chinese poem to English?
The emotions that are being referred to, I think, are understandable because they're human. And in a sense, sadness is universal and happiness is universal. But the means with which the emotion is constructed in the poem and then conveyed is specific to each language and specific to each cultural tradition. So one of the conventions for being heartbroken in Chinese poetry is to talk about guts.
Broken bones.
Broken guts. Now, I can sort of imagine and accept that if I wanted to be heartbroken in Chinese, I would talk about my broken guts. But really, in English, it's all about
the heart.
Heartbroken.
Yes.
Similarly, the idea of crying so much that blood comes out seems to be melodramatic and exaggerated. But again, you can accept in a different context that this is expressive of extreme grief. In the traditions that I'm familiar with, often there's that phrase "blood, sweat, and tears," and that implies sort of great effort. Yes. And suffering because of the effort. So we can sort of see that there's sometimes that they're used differently, but yet there are enough points of connection for us to understand that the emotional state that's being depicted is very human and very relatable.
Yep. Okay, so now we can sort of have David to read the whole poem for all of us.
Sure. Bai Juyi, Ballad of Eternal Regret. The Han Emperor thought all the time about the most beautiful women, but he ruled the world for many years without obtaining one. The Young family had a daughter who had just reached marriageable age, who was raised in their inner quarters and was not known. She was a natural beauty, difficult to ignore, so one day the monarch chose her to be by his side. A single backward glance and smile gave rise to 100 different charms. The imperial concubines of 6 palaces paled in comparison. In the cool spring, the emperor granted her a bath in his Huaqing hot springs. The hot waters were so smooth they moistened her delicate complexion. A servant girl helped her up and pampered the delicate beauty. This was the time she started to obtain the emperor's favour. Her hair was like a cloud, her face flowers, and she wore a golden hairpin. The emperor spent the spring nights with her in the warm embroidered curtains. The spring nights were bitterly short, and the sun rose high, From there on, the emperor stopped attending the early court sessions. She entertained the emperor and waited on him at banquets all year round. In the spring, he accompanied her on outings and spent every night with her. There were 3,000 beauties in the imperial harem, but of the 3,000, the emperor doted on just one. In a gilded room, she made herself up and waited for the emperor at night. In a jade tower after a feast, they got drunk and lustful. Each of her sisters and brothers were granted titles and land. Her parents' household was the envy of all. All the parents in the empire changed their minds and now preferred giving birth to daughters over sons. The Huaqing Palace on Mount Li reaches as high as the blue clouds. A breeze bore fairy music that could be heard everywhere. She danced and sang slowly to the music of strings and flutes. A whole day watching her was not enough for the emperor. An army from Yueyang arrived with an earth-shaking sound, startling them in the middle of the song Raiment of Rainbows and Feathers. Smoke and dust arose from the 9-layered watchtowers as 1,000 carriages and 10,000 riders left in a line for the southwest. Their emerald flags shook and shook as they marched and then stopped as they exited the west gate in a line more than 100 miles long. The 6 branches of the imperial army refused to take off, and the emperor felt hopeless, leaving the sweet and elegant beauty to die in front of his horse. Her golden hairpin fell on the ground with no one to collect it, along with her phoenix headdress and jade hairpin. The emperor covered his face and could not come to her rescue. Looking back, it seemed he was streaming tears of blood. The yellow dust was scattered by the wind, bleak and desolate. The mountain path in the clouds wound round as they ascended the Sword Fortress. They descended from Ermei Mountain with just a few men. Their banners and flags had lost their lustre in the pale sunlight. The rivers in Sichuan are jade green, the mountains dark blue. The emperor missed her greatly every day, every night. Looking at the moon from his travelling palace, he felt sad and aggrieved. On rainy nights, the tinkling sound of the wind charm broke his heart. As time passed, the imperial parade was to return to the capital, but at the place she died, the emperor hesitated and was unable to go on. Among the mud at the foot of the hill at Ma Wei, he couldn't see her beautiful face, just the empty site where she died. The emperor and his subjects looked at each other, their clothes soaked with tears. They gazed to the east to the capital's gate, trusting their horses would lead them back. When they returned, the imperial garden and lake were all unchanged. Lake Taiyi covered in water lilies and Weiyang Palace lined with willows. The water lilies were like her face, the willow leaves her eyebrows. In front of all these, how could he not let tears fall? He missed her in the spring when the peaches and plums blossomed, and in autumn when the leaves of the scholar tree fell. The western palace and the southern quarter were covered by autumn grass, the steps full of unswept fallen leaves and flowers. The Pear Garden Opera Troupe had newly grown white hair. The pretty young women in the empress's private apartments had grown old. In the evening, a firefly entered the hall where he sat in sorrow and kept pulling the wick of his lone lantern, unable to sleep. Slowly, the bells and drums marked the beginning of the long night, right up until the Milky Way dimmed just before dawn. The overlapping roof tiles were heavy with flowers of frost, but who would share the cold dark green quilt with him? The living and the dead had been separated for a long time, and her departed soul never entered his dreams. A very knowledgeable Taoist priest arrived from the Linqiong, who was able to perform a ritual summoning souls and spirits. He was touched by the emperor's tossing and turning, missing her, and following the emperor's order, this priest went out in search of her. He shot into the sky, driving through the air as fast as lightning, up to heaven and down to the ghost world, searching all over. He exhausted the blue sky and the yellow spring of the netherworld, but in neither of these two boundless places was she to be seen. Suddenly, he learned of an immortal mountain in the ocean, a mountain hovering between a mirage and the void. 5 coloured clouds rose up to the exquisitely wrought buildings, and in amongst them were many celestial nymphs. In their midst was one called Tai Jin, with snow-white skin, her face a blossom seemingly like her. He knocked on the jade door of the west wing of the palace and asked the immortal maids to announce his arrival. News of the Taoist emissary from the Son of Heaven startled her from her dreams behind some gorgeous bed curtains. She pulled on her clothes and pushed away the pillow, got up and paced around, and one by one she opened the pearl curtains and silk screens. Her cloud-like hair was dishevelled, just woken up from sleep, and with disordered flowery headdress she descended to the hall. The wind blew and lifted up her clothes, swaying, as if she was performing the raiment of rainbows and feathers dance. The beautiful nymph, silent and alone, wept on the balustrade like a twig of pear blossom in spring rain. With eyes full of feeling she thanked the Emperor's emissary. Since my departure, his voice and face have become indistinct. The love and affection we shared in Jiaoyang Hall has been severed. The days and nights I spend at Penglai Palace are so long. When I lower my head to gaze on the world of men, I can't see Chang'an for clouds of dust. I can only use old things to show my deep feeling for him and send my floral jewellery box and hairpin. She separated a pair of golden hairpins and divided her jewellery box into 2 parts, keeping for herself one of the hairpins and half of the jewellery box. I wish our hearts are as strong as the yellow gold, and that in heaven or on earth we will meet again. Before the priest departed, she was eager to repeat again her message, for in her words there was a vow only the 2 of them knew. On the 7th day of the 7th month, in the middle of the night, we whispered to each other. In the sky we would like to be lovebirds. On earth we would be 2 trees twined together. Heaven and earth last a very long time, but there is a time they will end. But this regret will never cease.
Well, thank you, David. That was a wonderful reading.
You're welcome.
So I was just wondering, do you know why the poem is still widely known in China, and maybe we were, people in the English world would also love this poem.
It's very hard to know why some poems are remembered and some poems are forgotten. It's something I was thinking about this morning. I think that there are some lines in there which really strike me. That image of her weeping on the balustrade and the simile of it being like a twig of pear with rain on it. That's a very startling, very clear image, and I think it's something that stays in my mind after I read it. And I suspect in the Chinese, it's quite vivid. There's also a lot of heightened emotion in this poem, very, very heightened emotion.
Yes.
And it's extremely dramatic. I mean, 6 armies refusing to go on until this concubine is murdered. The emperor, who you think is the Son of Heaven, is suddenly rendered powerless. That's extremely dramatic. It's comparable with scenes from Homer's Iliad, where mortals are behaving with almost immortal strength and valour and things like that.
Yes.
In this case, it's the helplessness, I think, that is very touching. And I think also the notion it's got elements of the Taoist mythology. There's an immortal who can fly up in the air and find that mountain floating on the ocean and find her. And the notion also, I think, there's that separating a pair of hairpins and breaking a jewellery box. That breaking is very sort of touching. It's almost as if you can only remember through breaking. Yes. And that's quite powerful, I think. And then at the end, that vow. It's something that for a Western reader I think is quite interesting, because there's a form of a tableware called willowware, which was developed in the middle of the 18th century by Josiah Wedgwood, I think it was. And it's got a picture of 2 lovebirds in the sky, and it's got a picture of an island and a woman behind a screen and a man running across a bridge. It's not it's not clear what the origin was, and it was probably just made up by an Englishman thinking that this seems Chinese. But that the pair of lovebirds in the sky would resonate with a lot of people because willowware is very, very common. Most households have some. And there's that sense there that you might want to be lovebirds in the sky or trees that have grown together and grown into each other, but yet the universe will end or the world will end and the regret won't. And that's very, very,
very powerful. Yeah. I think in Chinese, the 比翼鸟 is also a mythical bird. The bird actually share a pair of wings and share a pair of eyes, and they cannot be separated without killing both of them. So here it is. This is how it looked like, and the two trees sort of intertwined with each other. It's also another commonly used even today symbolizing romantic love. And people still using 比翼鸟 and 连理枝 as a way to symbolize the deep love between a couple.
So in the Chinese tradition, it's very much alive because there are symbols that are still understood and used today.
Yes. So thank you very much. So I think I quite enjoy your reading, and this experience is also quite interesting and quite enjoyable.
Thank you, Yin. Can I come back?
Yes, of course. Maybe we'll do more of this, in the future. I'm thinking about, the singing girl, the pipa player that we are translating now.
Yes.
And also other poems we've been working together. And, because when I have you here, you bring in the English perspective in reading the Chinese, which I don't understand, and I can bring in both the traditional and contemporary understanding of this classical poetry, because this kind of classical poetry is still very popular in China. Do you know in 2000, I think it was 2017, the most popular show is actually competition on classical Chinese poetry. They were testing how much can you remember, memorize one of these. And all these poems are still in the textbook of all school kids, so they are forced to memorize them.
It's very much a living poetic tradition. My favourite is Su Dongpo, so perhaps we could look at some of his poems.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for watching this video. And we'll certainly do more of this. Thank you.